Well, hello and welcome everyone to the Museum of the Bible, whether you can be here in person or you're joining us online. We are so glad that you can come and join what is sure to be a fascinating discussion on locating the lost city of the apostles. My name is Daniel Stevens, and I'm the director of the Scholars Initiative here at the Museum of the Bible. And before I hand this over to our speakers, I want to talk briefly about the Scholars Initiative and what we do here at the museum. If the mission of the Museum of the Bible is to invite all people to engage with the Bible, the Scholars Initiative's unique role is to support that mission through encouraging research and collegiate education. To do that, we design and support projects that investigate the stories of the Bible and show how those stories have been told and retold throughout time. We collaborate with external scholars tracing the impact of the Bible to the ways in which the Bible has been used and received in various cultures and communities. And, most relevant for tonight, we contribute to projects which research the history of the Bible. This is true both for the history of the transmission of the text and for the history of the times in which the various books of the Bible were written. We are dedicated to helping everyone gain a more accurate understanding of the contexts, composition, transmission, and impacts of the Bible. And to that end, we are delighted not only to support the archaeological work that Dr. Stephen Notley does, but also to host discussions like this, to make new research available and accessible to as many people as we can. We have partnered with Dr. Notley and the Center for the Study of Ancient Judaism and Christian Origins in support of this archaeological dig at El-Araj because it has great potential to increase our knowledge of the Galilee region during the Hellenistic, Roman, and Byzantine periods. Whether this is the site of the biblical Bethsaida, as I'm sure we're going to hear a lively discussion soon, it is doubtless that the archaeological work done through this project has provided and will provide a greater understanding into the Roman and Byzantine era life on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. So now, welcoming you all, I'm going to hand it over to Allison Mullins to introduce our speakers for the night. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Welcome again to Museum of the Bible. We're excited to have you all here. Just a few logistics before I introduce our speakers. We do have a microphone up here for our Q&A session at the end. So if you do have any questions, please go to the mic so that those who are listening online can hear you as well, including Professor Stephen Fine, who will be our respondent tonight and is joining us virtually. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Stephen Notley. Dr. Stephen Notley is a distinguished professor of New Testament and Christian Origins in the New York City campus of Nyack College and director of the graduate program in Ancient Judaism and Christian Origins. He received his PhD from the Hebrew University, where he studied with David Flusser. Dr. Notley lived for 16 years in Jerusalem with his wife and 4 children, during which time he was the founding chair of the New Testament Studies program at the Jerusalem University College. He's the author of many books and articles. He continues collaborative research and publication with Israeli scholars in the fields of historical geography, ancient Judaism, and Christian origins. Since 2016, he has served as the academic director of the El-Araj Excavation project in its search for first century Bethsaida Julius, the lost city of the apostles. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Notley.
Okay, thank you for coming this evening. Just checking, make sure we're on, the mic's on, okay. Again, thanks for coming out this evening, both those of you that are here present and also those who are joining us online through Zoom. We're going to start this evening talking a little bit about the excavations, what brought us to the excavations at El-Araj, the ideas behind it, the questions that we're trying to answer. And I look forward also to the opportunity to engage Professor Stephen Fine, who I'm sure will have some things to contribute as well as we explore this topic. A couple of things about this site and the excavations here. I need to start off saying First, we have a couple of people here who are excavating, have been volunteers on the site, and that's always something that's available to people who are interested in participating in the dig for a couple of weeks. We make that available to you. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And I look forward to this opportunity that we have to engage the Museum of the Bible in their Scholars Initiative, being a part of the research that's going on here. We've been very much enjoyed our relationship with Steve and Jackie Green, and they have been great supporters of us for the last few years and really have made possible what we've been able to accomplish there through their generosity. So about myself, again, talking about in terms of how I approach this material, first thing I need to say is that I'm a historian by training. That's my training. I'm not trained as a formal archaeologist. Some of you may be disappointed in that, but that's, I believe that you come at these things in a multidisciplinary fashion. As you heard, I lived many years in Israel, and one of the things about studying history, literature of the ancient periods, living on site, is you start getting a sense of the interplay between text and land and the contours of land and how we read these ancient stories. And that really is what brought me to this site and exploring, looking at the whole question of the site identification of Bethsaida Julius. A lot of times people ask the question, how do you lose a city? How, if I'm going to assume that you're not archaeologists, we may have some here in the audience, but a lot of times people ask the question, how do you lose a city? And that actually is not as difficult as you would, or unique as one might imagine. If you go to Israel, you get off the bus, you go to various places and visit biblical sites, you see a sign there, maybe you have your picture taken, and by the sign, you're at Capernaum, you're at Caesarea, you're at various locations, and you assume people have always known that, and that's just not true. Most of our biblical sites in Israel were lost in time. Now, the memory remained there, communities remained there, and so their identification was not in question. But a lot of the sites that you visit today at Megiddo or Ekron, which is an ancient Philistine city, even Capernaum, Chorazin, which are mentioned in the Gospels, together with Bethsaida, they were destroyed, abandoned, and forgotten. And it's only been in the last 150 years that there's been a process of rediscovery of these places as travel became easier. European travelers, American travelers, people who came over, researchers who began to sort of open the text, look at the contours of land and try to match those. Archaeology in the land of Israel really only began at the end of the 19th century. So the early explorers did not have the luxury we have today in terms of excavating, either confirming or maybe finding out that their assumptions were incorrect. And of course, that brings us to the site of Bethsaida, which is mentioned by Josephus, is mentioned in the New Testament, of course, in the Gospels in connection with the life and the ministry of Jesus. It also shows up in classical literature and classical Roman literature, as well as early rabbinic literature. And all of those give us information and describe what we should be looking for, what we should expect to find when we're looking at the site of Bethsaida. Early on, we had a New Yorker named Edward Robinson, who was a scholar and came out, was the beginning, the father of historical geography in the early part of the 19th century, and came out on a couple of trips and wrote and sort of made ideas and identified many of the sites that we have today are a result of his work. And he suggested that a site called Et Tel was the site of ancient Bethsaida. And that idea still today is one of the two main alternatives. Again, this is in the 1830s, 1840s. Robinson is making this statement. Not everyone accepted his theory. Another scholar, Gottlieb Schumacher, challenged that and suggested an alternate site. He suggested the site that we're currently excavating at El-Araj. And his reasoning was fairly simple. Sometimes this isn't nuclear science. Sometimes it's a matter of common sense. His biggest challenge with the site of Et-Tel, where Robinson had suggested, and where the current, at least for the last 30 years or so, they have claimed they have Bethsaida. His main argument was that it's too far from the lake shore. Everything that we have about Bethsaida in the literature is that it is on the lake shore. We have people arriving by boat. We have its association with fishing. And we even have very, very clear descriptions of it being positioned, situated on the lake shore. The problem of Et-Tel, I would say one of two problems. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the other site tonight, but I should at least acknowledge them so you can think, that I'm not just ignoring them. But two of the main problems is, one is its distance from the lake. It's about 1.5 miles, 3 kilometers from the lake shore, which is a long way from the water if you're a fishing village, which is the reputation of Bethsaida. The other one we'll address in just a minute. But again, all of the literature, if we look in the literature that is written about it, both in the New Testament as well as in Josephus, we have references to it being either on the shore, people arriving there by boat. And again, I've given a couple of references here. Mark 6:15, immediately and made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida. Also hear this from Josephus. We hear about troops coming during the Jewish revolt, reinforcements coming from across the lake and arriving to the name Julius. We're going to take that up in a minute. You've already heard reference to this as Bethsaida Julius. And again, that's part of the discussion about this site and what we should expect to find when we're excavating. And finally, John's gospel, we hear about it being the home of the apostles, Peter, Andrew, and Philip. And that's how we get the name of the lost city of the apostles. This was the home of the apostles, and we know that they were about the business of fishing. So there's this strong attachment, association between the site of Bethsaida and the fishing industry. This has posed a problem for 30 years for the excavators of the other site, and they actually have suggested that the lake in the first century was much higher than everyone assumed, or certainly is higher than it is today, and 5 meters. So that's, for Americans, that's about 16 feet. And if this causes no end of problem, because if the lake is actually as high as they suggest in their reports, every known settlement around the lake would be underwater. Everyone that you visit, Capernaum, Magdala, Tiberias, would all be underwater. So it creates a huge problem. But it's the way that they've chosen to try to resolve the distance from the lake, because we have a large plain there. And again, the measurements, the elevations that I'm giving here are the ones that they give in their own reports. The second problem, which is, I think is now a problem after 30 years of excavation, is one of the things that we hear in the description of Bethsaida is that it is transformed into a polis, into a city. And it is urbanized. And one of the things lacking in the excavations, the over 30 years of excavation, is no evidence of urbanization. We don't have the things that we would expect to find in an urbanized city, taking of a Jewish village and transforming it and making it into an urban center. And so I usually just refer to the evaluation, the assessment of Jody Magnus from the University of North Carolina. She says, while the Iron Age remains at Bethsaida, by that she means Et-Tel, are monumental and impressive, the Roman period remains are very poor, and therefore the site does not look like an urban center. What we do is we have a lot of things to see there. When you go there, it's, and I when I'm with groups, I take them there, but you have Iron Age, Old Testament period remains. When you move into the Hellenistic period and the Roman period, that would be the New Testament period, the physical remains diminished significantly, both in terms of structures, pottery, coins, and it right at the time that we would expect it to be expanding and reaching its zenith in size and prominence is precisely the time when it's diminishing. So it doesn't fit the descriptions of eyewitnesses who have walked the streets, have been there, both New Testament, outside the New Testament, and it doesn't seem to fit. And that's where my work as an historical geographer comes along, because I hold together the work of archaeologists and then also the history and the witness that we have of those who are on site, and try to look at those. If we have a description of a particular site, if you're excavating and you're not exactly sure what that site is, and you have historical descriptions from multiple directions, multiple sources describing either settlement or destruction or whatever event is described in the historical sources, and you excavate on the site and there's nothing to be found at that time period, it should at least be a reason to pause and to reconsider and ask, am I on the site that's mentioned in the literature? And so it's that disconnect that drew me to sort of engage this question a little bit more seriously at the site of Bethsaida. I mentioned the description of the urbanization of the site. One of the most important passages that we have is from Josephus. He was given a responsibility for fortifying the Galilee. He knew these places intimately, and he describes the site of Bethsaida. In fact, in all of his writings, he only uses the name one time. He usually uses the Hellenized name of Julius, but he mentions Bethsaida one time, and he says, to the village of Bethsaida, located next to the lake of Gennesaret, that would be the local name for the Sea of Galilee, Herod Philip granted the dignity of a city by introducing a multitude of inhabitants and other fortifications, and he called it Julius, after the name of the daughter of the emperor. Now, he does get a little bit confused on which Julius that is, but we don't have time to delve into that this evening. But the important thing for us is his very precise language, that he takes a village, and in Greek, kome, and he transforms it into a polis, into a city. It's very specific in his description. And again, this is the one time he mentions the name Bethsaida. And that's been our contention, is that there's no evidence of urbanization at the other site. None of the things that we would expect to find if we were excavating and finding that development. So again, these are the first century witnesses. As we move forward, we do have a couple of witnesses. Pliny actually mentions Julius. We also have a geographer, Claudius Ptolemy, also in the 2nd century, makes reference to Julius. And that's how most people know it. It's a very interesting question as to why the New Testament does not use the Greek name. It doesn't seem to have a problem with other ones like Caesarea, Tiberius. It doesn't seem to have any difficulty with that, but at least on this site, it doesn't seem to ever use the name Julius. It doesn't use the name Julius. And in that, it's very similar to rabbinic literature. We have all kinds of discussions about it. Some of these questions cannot be answered definitively. Everybody has an idea. But one of the interesting things is that it's like rabbinic literature in that regard, that it does not use the name Julius. It retains the older Semiticized name. But that's, again, we continue to have witnesses to the site. But about the 3rd century, towards the end of the 3rd century, it disappears. When I say disappears, I'm talking in terms of the literary witnesses. There's no more reference to it. It goes silent. And one of the ones that I think is important is Eusebius. He is the bishop of Caesarea. He's also a church historian. He does a work that a lot of times people do not focus on, It's called the Onomasticon. It's actually a list of biblical sites, mainly in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, the Gospels. And he describes them. He actually sometimes measures and tells us where they're located from metropolitan centers. And so it's a very important work for sort of the cornerstone for archaeology or historical geography, trying to locate where these places are. It's interesting when he comes to this entry on Bethsaida, he tells us nothing from his own personal observation. The entry is Bethsaida, city of Andrew, Peter, and Philip, which comes from John 1:44. And the second half, it is located in the Galilee next to the Lake of Gennesaret, which is from Josephus. And on other occasions, he actually credits where he gets his material. But when Eusebius does not give us information, sometimes he'll tell us who's living there. It's a village of Christians, Jews, Samaritans, or he'll describe that there are remains there, relics there, ruins there to be seen. He'll describe personal information that he's observed. When he gives us no information, that means he doesn't know anything about it. He doesn't know where it is. Sometimes there's nothing to be seen. It's disappeared. And that seems to be the case with Bethsaida. I underscore that because in our excavations, we found an uncanny correspondence to this, that when the literature goes silent about Bethsaida, it corresponds precisely to a gap in the material evidence as well. I will just say that the same thing happens in rabbinic literature. We have references to sages who come from or are located at Bethsaida. They call it Sidon. There's a discussion in the scholars as to whether this is speaking of Sidon or Bethsaida. It doesn't usually use the prefix bait on it. There's a whole discussion about that, but generally, a lot of scholars think that we do have it mentioned in rabbinic literature. But once again, about the 3rd century, it goes silent. Something happens that it disappears, and it disappears for about 200 years. In the 6th century, we hear it referenced one more time by a pilgrim. Mostly what we get from here out are pilgrimage reports. We have mentioned by a man named Theodosius in 530 who mentions Bethsaida. He doesn't tell us anything really about it, but at least we know it's visible. People know where it is. The Christian community can identify it after 200 years of silence. More importantly for us is, or equally important, is a Byzantine pilgrim named Willibald, the Bishop of Bavaria, who comes out and gives his itinerary. And when he comes, I'll just go to the points that are important to us. He's moving in a counterclockwise, in a clockwise direction around the lake, listing where he goes. And when he comes to Bethsaida, after Capernaum, then they went to Bethsaida, from which Peter and Andrew, and there is now a church where previously was their houses. So they built a church. He testifies to a church being built over the house of Peter and Andrew. And again, that's important in terms of our excavations. So I hope you understand my approach. My approach is to paint a picture from eyewitnesses who were there. That's how I go at this as a historical geographer. They paint a picture of what we should expect to find. And the question is, when we excavate, does it fit? Does it match? Does it correspond to what how they describe it? So again, this was the situation into the 19th century. As I've told you, there were various opinions about where Bethsaida was. We hear people visiting the site of El-Araj, which is, again, where we're excavating, and they testify to architectural fragments on the ground that are present there and are visible. And I have a statement here from Sir Lawrence of Oliphant, who talks about foundations of old walls, blocks of basalt stones, cut and uncut. And we have some of those as well that we've gathered together that were found on the surface. They were not excavated out, but they were left there. So as more and more, again, the excavation of the other site, and some of us were a little bit uneasy with the claims, because essentially the site of Etel that was excavated was declared to be Bethsaida in the first season. And so it's been called that. It's actually called the Bethsaida Exploration Project. And so in the midst of all of that, some of us were writing and suggesting that this needed to be rethought. And so starting about 10, 15 years ago, I published in a peer-reviewed journal an article called "Etel is not Bethsaida." So I thought, why mess about? Just go straight to the point. Why be ambiguous? And I wasn't, in spite of what some people think, I was actually arguing for El-Araj. That is not the thrust of the article. My article was saying there's a problem here. This does not match what we should expect to find. And in light of that, we should start looking elsewhere. And others had said it as well. I certainly was not the first, but this was the first time in a peer-reviewed journal that it was stated, and so it sort of caused a bit of consternation. And that eventually led to our work there. In 2014, Mark Turnage, a former student of mine, helped organize a shovel survey on site. And a shovel survey is when you dig down about 30 centimeters, and you sift the top. You're not allowed to actually dig deep. You just sift off to the top, and a good archaeologist can look at the type of ceramics, pottery, coins, perhaps, things that are left, and can describe from that shovel survey, can give you a profile of the site. Based on the profile of the site, we decided that we could dig for 2 or 3 seasons and see, it matched. The profile that came out of the shovel survey matched what you would expect to see, which is basically late Hellenistic, Roman, into the Byzantine period, and even Islamic and later periods. So we set about excavating in 2016, and I'm going to go at this. I'm assuming that you're not archaeologists, so I'm going to what I'm doing is I'm going back in time. I'm starting at the surface level, and then we'll go back in terms of what we've discovered on site. The Israelis know the site by a different name. They call it Beit HaBek. It's the Bek's house, and it was named after a Kurdish aristocrat who lived here in the 19th and 20th century. He had a large villa. We don't have that many pictures of it. You can see it here off to the right. The white building was on the lake shore, and he lived there. And what the interesting thing about that for us is that we have a story by a minister named Rudolf de Haas, and he wrote a book, Galilee, the Sacred Sea, and he talks about going to visit one day, got in a boat, went, and they traveled over there, hoping to meet and talk with him. He wasn't there, but the Arab workmen were digging down, doing some work, and they were digging, and he said he saw magnificent mosaics, colored mosaics. They didn't know what to do with it, and so they just covered it back up. So we knew there was something under the ground. And again, this is the kind of evidence you get. Sometimes you get it in the most unusual places. But this is Beit HaBek, or El-Araj, and we began excavating in 2016. Today, the site is removed from the lake shore. You can see here, I've drawn it out. The red line is actually, and you can demonstrate this. This is where the first century shoreline was. It's very clear, the original shoreline. What you have, this serpentine river here is actually the Jordan River. The Jordan River, they experienced a severe storm in 1969, which damaged the point of entry of the Jordan River into the Sea of Galilee. This is on the northern side, not on the southern end. And it blocked up, and it had caused a lot of silting. And so since that time, the Jordan River has been sort of making its way. It does different things. Trust me, this last summer we had problems because it flooded. It flooded our site. But in the first century, then this is the shoreline, which was right at the place of El-Araj. Everything you see here again is silting as a result of that storm in 1969 and subsequent to that. We began digging in 2016, and we particularly two sites that two areas, Area A and Area B, which were right up against the Beck's house. I should have mentioned, and I haven't to this point, I should mention, the director of the excavation is Moti Aviyam. He's a professor at Kinneret College. And Moti decided that we needed to excavate near to the Beck's house in hopes of finding the mosaics. That's why we were digging where we were. We dug several squares. Again, everything that we were finding was sort of reinforcing our assumptions, but nothing really, no telltale signs yet. And we were digging as we're digging down. Couple of shots again. We rise early in the morning. It gets very hot there, and we dig in squares, and we take those, retrieve the things that we dig out. We put them in buckets, and they're sifted, and then those are collected. And at the end of the day, we will soak them for a day or two. Then we'll clean them, and we will have a time of reading the pottery. And that's where Moti will come in, analyze it in terms of its style, its typology. You'll tolerate a non-archaeologist to throw this up, because I get this question. People ask me, well, what can you tell from a pot or a certain style? And I found this one time on the internet. I thought it was a great example. Is that if you look at the vessels of the containers for Coke, it's changed in time. And if you dig one up, you know what period that it came from. And of course, I also tell kids, I said, a few years ago, you used to have let's go to the cans, you'd take the top off, you'd pull it off until we realized that we were killing dolphins with these little things there. So now you take them and it stays on there, it doesn't become detached. But all of these styles change in time. So this is a part of archaeology that, at least in the land of Israel, started around the end of the 19th. Flinders Petrie came up with this idea that you could date the strata of a particular site to tell by the style of pottery. You could go about dating it and, of course, compare it to other sites in the country. So we started at the top and the level, and we started digging down, and we immediately came upon the Crusader period, a sugar factory, remains from a sugar factory of vessels, ceramic vessels that were there. The Crusaders didn't really build anything. They occupied things, structures that were already there, but they had production. This is something that's known in the Jordan Valley, production of sugar. We had the experience of taking those vessels, sending them off. The picture that you see here, that's Moti Aviyam, by the way, on the left. Where they gave them, and they were actually reconstructed by a group from a senior home. They were trained for 2 years on how to do this. And the senior citizens, Israeli senior citizens, actually put these vessels back together again. And they brought them here. And they were so proud when this is the day they brought them back and presented them to the team there. So, but again, this is the upper levels, the level of the Crusader period. As you're digging down, of course, you come to the next period, which is the Byzantine period. The Byzantine period is where we first start encountering structures. We have pots. We have one of the more interesting things that came to surface there was if you look in the upper left-hand corner, is the little tessera. These are not stone tessera, these are glass tessera, and they're gilded in gold, they're colored, and they belong not on the floor, but on walls. And they belong to they only appear in churches. So this was our first hint that we were on the site of a church. And that opened up to all kinds of discussion. People were telling Multi, no, that's misguided, it's not there. References to that church are actually at Capernaum, and not to the site that you're located. And we kept saying, yeah, but there's these tessera everywhere, these glass tessera. Also, we had substantial walls, 30 meters long. This seems to be a church and a monastery that surrounded the church, used for greeting pilgrims there. Multi decided, again, this is in 2017, Multi decided to dig two probes, Western probe, which is the one on the right, and the Eastern probe, the one on the left. As we had excavated on down, you can see the Byzantine structure that I was making reference to. And as we came, we encountered some archaeological remains, fragments, things from the Byzantine period. And suddenly we had a gap of about 40 centimeters where there was nothing but loose soil, like sandy type soil with nothing in it, no coins, no pottery, 40 centimeters of silt, basically is what it was. Later we found out it was from the Jordan, results of the flooding from the Jordan, not the Sea of Galilee, but from the Jordan River. And we had about 40 centimeters of that. And then immediately below that, everything below it was Roman period. We had Roman structure, Roman finds, and there was this gap. And again, about a 40 centimeter gap, if you remember what I said earlier about silence on the site, no mention of the site for about 200 years. There's an uncanny correspondence between the excavation and what the excavation found and what we have either said or not said about the site in the historical sources. On the left-hand side is the Eastern probe. I'll show you a little bit more on that in a bit, but also some significant finds there that help dating with a coin from Nero in the year 66. Again, everywhere you go on this area, in Area A, you can find evidence of this gap of period of time between Byzantine material above it and Roman material below. In the Roman period, we found typical pottery belonging to the Galilean style pottery, lots of it. And it clearly dated, and as I mentioned, also coins. In the Western probe, the most important thing, and this sort of caught the attention of the international media, is that we suddenly came upon mosaics in the Roman level. These we at first thought perhaps as the mosaics that belonged to a church, but then there were other things that belonged to it that suggested this was not a church. Not a church, a synagogue. This was not a synagogue, but instead belonged to a bathhouse. The challenge actually is, one of the things that it challenged was the level of the lake, because the level of the mosaics was at 211 meters below sea level, which is about 2 to 3 meters below what everyone assumed the lake, not the folks at Tel, but everyone had assumed the lake had been. You don't build on the seashore, on the lake shore, 2 to 3 meters, 10 feet below the level of the water. It means that our assumptions regarding the level of the lake were considerably off. And again, these are found in situ in their location. and it has caused considerable discussion about our thoughts regarding the level of the lake in the first century. As I mentioned to you, not only were there mosaics found, they're two-color, white and black bichrome mosaics, but also they found with it the vents, tubuli. So we know that this was an area of a Roman bath. This was the first time in the region, in the area, that evidence had been found of the urbanization of a site. This is exactly what we should be expecting to find in Josephus's description about Herod Philip transforming this village and making it a polis. As I mentioned, also in the eastern side and the probe, we found a Roman coin, which helps to date that we're dealing with early Roman period in that. Here's a picture of the coin from Nero. And again, those finds from 2017 really gave us some attention. People finally were saying, before then, people were really raising a question as to whether, because the other site had been excavated for 30 years, but suddenly we were finding things that matched the historical description of the site. One of the unusual things that was discovered, not during our excavations, but was found by a group that visited the site, a tour group visited the site and was sort of pillaging through some of the remains there. And they came across this large basalt lioness, which probably, according to the archaeologists, probably belonged to a synagogue somewhere in the vicinity, perhaps on our site or a nearby site. In 2017, we expanded our work in Area A, again, looking at the Byzantine level, confirming that what we were looking at was a series of buildings, probably a monastery attached to the church. Kept finding the little glass tessera, but no church yet. But we kept finding evidence of it. And not only that, we would find as well parts of a chancel screen. We kept finding things that belonged to a church. More and more evidence that this is a base for a chancel screen. We were finding evidence of a church there, but not actually finding the church. I'm going to move forward quickly here. We had another area, Area B, which was nearby. It had as well early Roman remains from lamps, pottery, other things, even frescoed walls. So we have evidence of this is not a simple village anymore. It's actually developed and it fits the description that we would be looking for. In 2000, I'm going to move forward. 2019, which was last year. 2019, we set about to continue our area in Area A, but also to see the extent of the settlement there. There were some suggestions you'll hear occasionally suggesting that our Roman bath is just is an army camp. And so Multi decided to excavate 100 meters to the north, which would be too large for a Roman camp, and to see what was there, to see if there was settlement there as well. So that's became known as Area C. As we continue to expand Area A, more and more elements from the Byzantine period coming to surface, and finally the church. And this was, we knew it was there, even though we couldn't see it or find it. We didn't actually have the remains from it. We just had fragments, tessera, things from the church. But last summer, 2019, we actually were able to find the church, the mosaics. The mosaics extend beyond the church or around the church, but they actually, the picture that you see on the right-hand side is the aisle of the church. We actually could identify the aisle of the church and the beginning of the nave. The colors change as you're moving inward. The colors get more ornate, becomes a more sophisticated mosaic, and we expect to see more of that as we excavate in the coming season. Here's some of the pictures of that. As you can see, there's a change. It starts to, you have the definite patterns which belong to other Byzantine churches. So we're right on the edge of the church. We're on the outside aisle of the church, but we fully expect when we excavate to the north and to the east to uncover a church that's probably, estimates probably 20 meters by 30 meters. So it's not a small chapel. It's a pretty good sized church that's there. It has, again, elements of it are coming to the surface. The other things that were found in Area A, one of the more interesting things was we always were finding fishing weights. One of the fascinating things that we found was a mold. What you have there on the left-hand side is actually a mold for, it had another complementary matching piece, and lead would be put in, and for making of a mold, making of a lead weight for nets. And they had a particular, you can see the cross-check type of style. It seems that that's a signature style for that person, marking it that it's theirs, that they're a person who's wanting to make sure that no one goes off with their nets. As I mentioned as well, we expanded to Area C, which is about 100 meters to the north. And in that excavation, we found first century homes, walls, and as well as numerous coins. Of the coins found in Area C, 16 are from the first century, including 2 or 3, which may be as early as the first century BC. There are 2 coins of Herod Philip, 12 coins are from the 2nd century CE, 3 from the 3rd century, and 1 from the 4th century. So we have lots of coins found in that area. Again, this is sort of a probe out there. There's a lot to be excavated. It's 100 meters away from the main excavation site. One of the things that we did right at the end of the season was to do electromagnetic imaging. Think of like GPR, but a little bit more sophisticated. It's a different science, and found between Area C and Area A, that 100 meters, that there are many walls, structures that are to be found underneath the ground, just waiting to be excavated. So there's a lot there to be done. This is not a small site. It's a large site. We're looking at several years of excavation. Here, if you have a sort of a creative eye, we had right at the end of the excavation, we had people line up. This is the outside of the church. You can see the apse on the top there, where the people are standing right here, or where the pillar bases were. So this is a sizable church that was built there, and according to the pilgrims, built over the house of Peter and Andrew. Again, we'll be excavating next year, God willing. We have to say God willing these days, especially during these interesting times. But we are hopeful that we weren't able to dig this last summer, just like almost every other excavation in the country. No non-Israelis were allowed into the country. You could not come into the country. So we were unable to excavate. We're hoping that things will be such that we can get back next summer and to excavate the site. Again, if those of you who are interested would want to join us, we have 2 two-week sessions of the excavation, and an attempt to find what is, I sometimes like to say, the last lost city of the Gospels. It's the one that we did not know exactly where it is. If you're interested, again, I've given some contact information there. You can contact me if you have questions about the dig, or information about participating in the dig. So I'll stop there and let Steve take over. I don't know exactly how this works, but I'll go with it.
Hi, everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Hello.
Hello, Washington.
You're quite large behind us. This is Professor Stephen Fine. He's the Dean Pincus Chergin Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University and the director of the Yeshiva University Center for Israel Studies, the Archaeology of the Arch of Titus Project, and the Yeshiva University Israelite Samaritans Project. A cultural historian of ancient Judaism, Fine's most recent book is The Menorah, From the Bible to Modern Israel. His Art and Judaism in Greco-Roman World Toward a New Jewish Archaeology book received the 2009 Jordan Schnitzer Award of the Association for Jewish Studies. Fine is a founding editor of Images, a journal for the study of Jewish art and visual culture, and his next exhibition, The Samaritans, a Biblical People, will open at Yeshiva University's museum in fall of 2021. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Fine.
Hi, everyone. About a decade ago, I found myself, as I do about once a month, sitting in a coffee shop with my friend Steve Notley. And he pulled out this book that we both knew of pilgrims. And he said, "Do you ever notice this guy, Willaban, the bishop from Bavaria?" And I looked at him and said, "No." He said, "Well, let's read what this thing says." And we read it. And he said, "I think that Bethsaida is there." Why? For the reasons that Dr. Notley just described, that from Capernaum, he went to Bethsaida, and in Bethsaida, he saw a church which was related to specific New Testament themes. And then he continued his way around the lake. And I said, "Oh, that's cool." And listened and watched and thought about all those rabbinic texts I know that talk about a place called Sidon, which sometimes means Sidon in Lebanon, but every so often means this place along the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And I thought, oh, that's cool. That means such and such happened here and such passed here. And we would just sort of imagine together Josephus evacuating his soldiers on ships back to Magdala at the end of the major battle. And we would imagine Jesus there. And then we would imagine the rabbis there. And we were having a grand old time, except up the hill, there's this place with a sign on it that says Bethsaida. That always bothered me. Why? Because it's up the hill in the back. But never paying much attention, I didn't pay much attention. Now, here's the problem. When you put up a sign, it changes reality. And we put up signs for all sorts of reasons. After all over the Galilee, there are signs with, let's say, Rabbi so-and-so is buried here and Rabbi so-and-so is buried there. There's even a sign that says that Esther and Mordecai are buried up there too. People like to find their culture heroes close by. And in the modern period, a whole crew of mostly Protestant, but some Catholic and then some Jewish explorers came looking for culture heroes. Charles Warren went to Jerusalem, and it's not surprising that this Freemason, this British Freemason, went looking for the temple. And it's not surprising that Schumacher, the German, went to the Galilee and figured out where he thought the original Bethsaida was, or that lots of people considered a particular site to be the original Capernaum or Kfar Nahum, and they found it. Of course, there's the Catholic Church there and the Greek Church there. Or that a few years later, E.L. Sukenik went to the Galilee looking for synagogues as well. And there's lots of other people I could quote, but they're all looking, using modern scientific methods, or trying to use modern scientific methods, but they're looking for something. Now, for Sukenik, he was looking for ancient Jewish life in the Galilee, in particular for Jews of the Talmudic period. For Schumacher, he was naturally looking for Old and New Testament characters, right? All of us are looking because there's always that tension between history and heritage. We may use the tools of what we think is objective history, but there's always some bug inside of us that said, I want to find that place, right? I want to know where this happened. I want to see that place. And if we control it carefully, we can actually sometimes come up with a pretty good answer. But the signs of previous generations can sometimes get in the way, or even the signs of new generations. So let's play for a moment. You know, there's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and there's the Garden Tomb. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre has a pretty good chance to be a place of crucifixion and burial, just as it claims. The Garden Tomb was people who just didn't like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right? So it's a different kind of pilgrimage site, a different kind of holy site that was constructed by Protestants in the 19th century. Once you put a sign up, a lot of things happen, including monetary investment and pilgrimage, right? And pilgrimage hotels and pilgrimage sites and pilgrimage little trinkets and all those things that go with pilgrimage. And so it becomes an industry. And so it's very hard once you have identified point A as one thing to decide that point B might just be it. And we're in that position now with Bethsaida. Which place is it? Is it the city on the hill that was identified and you heard, and I've been hearing for more than a decade, that can't be right? Or is it that place in the middle of the marsh, which astonishingly has a 40-centimeter band of silt between the Roman city and the Byzantine city? Now, some of this has nothing to do with heritage versus history. It has to do with instinct of the scholar. Now, some of us are separators. We take the various kinds of sources and we say, well, we'll do the archaeology over here, and we're going to do the text over here, or better yet, we're going to do the New Testament text over here, but we better not look at the rabbi text because it's another kind of literature, and certainly shouldn't look at the church fathers text because that's another kind of literature. And very often that's accommodated by the fact that people who know Greek real well don't always know Hebrew real well and don't necessarily know Aramaic real well or Latin. And none of us can control all the material. And certainly nobody can control all the archaeology and control all those languages. And so the instinct, the natural instinct, is that the person who does Latin studies Latin stuff and says it's around there somewhere. And the person who does Greek studies Greek stuff and says it's around there somewhere. And the person who does Hebrew and Aramaic, Talmudic stuff like me, looks over there and says, oh, I'm really interested in that. And so each of us does our thing, and that's it. So that's the separators. Then there's a group that my friend Paula Fredrickson calls the lumpers. The lumpers are the people who are dying to put things together. So there's the separators and the lumpers. Now, the lumpers, like me, which is what I do for a living, are interested in taking archaeological materials and literary materials and jumping from language to language if necessary, and talking to people who know the other language better than they do, or the archaeology better than they do, or the text better than they do, and putting together a picture that feels cogent and sometimes can lead to places we wouldn't have expected. So who would have gone to Willaban, the bishop of Bavaria, and ended up finding a 40-centimeter band in the ground, right? And a church and a Jewish city underneath, a Roman city, which is a Jewish city, right? A lumper. And that lumper in this case is named Steve Notley, whose interest in geography and interest in archaeology and interest in text and willingness to talk to people who don't quite know what he knows and can fill in the spaces, but together they know everything on the subject, can allow for a fundamental paradigm shift. And that's what's so exciting about this project. It's not whether for sure this is Bethsaida, which I sort of think it is, but it's how does one construct an argument with all those kinds of sources that can cogently deal with that material and possibly come to a new conclusion. Now, let's suppose that everyone should decide that Notley's site is really Bethsaida. Huh? All right, Aviam's site is really Bethsaida. Hopefully 20 years from now, someone will come and say, what about that other city right over there? Maybe he's wrong. And the gracious and smart and professional thing for all of us to do is say, well, maybe let's try it out. And the paradigms change and the answers change, but the method is always the same, of scientific exploration and willingness to say, I was right, or sometimes maybe I was wrong. And for me, that's really, really important. And so in dealing with everything we've talked about, the lumpers and the separators and heritage and history, all of those come together in the lecture that we just heard, because after all, if this was some village in the middle of Turkey, we may not be sitting here having this conversation, or we might, or in South America, or in Pennsylvania, right? But we're talking about a place that two religious traditions find really interesting. Christians for obvious reasons, and Jews also for obvious reasons, because where for Jews, this city is important because of Josephus and Jesus and the Talmud. For Christians, there's a much higher value in finding the place where Jesus walked and where Peter was. Now, I point out, that's why Willaban went there too. And that's why we all go back over and over again. And I hope that that's what you were up to too in coming to this talk tonight. And so I want to thank Steve Notley for laying this out so beautifully and letting me sort of ruminate about it for the last few minutes. Thank you, everyone. So what do we do now?
We're waiting on Allison.
Sorry. Thank you so much. So now we're going to open the floor to questions. So for those watching online, feel free to type them into the Q&A and we'll send them to the speakers. Otherwise, if you're in the room, feel free to come up to the mic for any of your questions. Thank you.
We have someone tentatively approaching the mic, Steve.
Yeah.
I do look big there, don't I?
Yeah, you are big, yes.
I was wondering if you think maybe Herod Philip compelled a large group of people to move there, and maybe some decades later, maybe you know, those families moved back to where they were from. It seemed just kind of abrupt the way he enlarged the city. Just kind of curious about that.
Okay. Did you hear the question, Steve? Okay. I would venture, first of all, he doesn't, we're not exactly certain when he began. Most people would assume it's around 30 CE. And he dies about 4 years later. He doesn't have a lot of, he doesn't live long. So in terms of the founding of the city, again, there are reasons. Generally, it has to do with coins that they've found that suggests that perhaps he founded it in 30, and so it only exists about 4 years. I would, you know, you said perhaps he compelled people to live there and then they left. We continue to hear about, I'll repeat, we continue to hear about the city into the 2nd century. So there does seem to be some presence there in the Greek literature as well as the rabbinic material. They speak as well of Sidon. If we take those texts to be the texts that are generally identified as being Bethsaida, not Sidon, because they're discussing the land of Israel, and Sidon's never been in the land of Israel. But Sidon maybe. So there seems to be a continuing witness to a presence there, at least for a couple hundred years. Steve?
First of all, this is a very nice place. There's no reason to be forced to live there, right? the Beck went there for a reason, because it's a very nice seashore. Okay, and it has lots of opportunities for economic advancement, and it's on the road that leads all the way from Kfar Kana, which is near Nazareth today, or Zipori, all the way around Tiberias, and continues past Gamla and onward to Syria. And so it's a very good place to be, as it is today. If you've been in that region, it's a very pleasant place to be, especially in the winter. Now, so I don't see any reason to be forced, but look, we have stories of, for example, these two fellows in Sidon. And what do they do in Sidon? Well, one of them lights his Hanukkah menorah starting with 8 lamps and then goes down to 1. And the other one starts with 1 and goes up to 8. And so here on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, there's all sorts of discussions into what people do and how real life works in a town in the 3rd century that continues and prospers and becomes a Roman city. And I just want to go back to something that Professor Notley mentioned before. You know, we keep calling it Bethsaida Julius, right? And I'm reminded that it is strange that the New Testament and the rabbis call it Bethsaida, and in Roman terms it would be Julius. But then again, Beit Shan is Scythopolis, right? And so having a Hebrew name for a Jewish place that's different from the one that the Roman imperialist conquerors called it, right? The colonialist, makes a certain sense. So Lod, in the where the airport is Deo Caesarea. And so having a dual named system where Jews would call their places by historic Hebrew names, and Romans, or some Jews too, are speaking a different language, would call them by Greek names or Latin Greek names, makes perfect sense, I think, in this part of the world. Why not Tiberias? Because Tiberias was a new city named for Tiberius, and so it had one name. But the peculiar one for me is Christians in the Byzantine period who don't call Jerusalem Jerusalem, but call it Aelia, as in Aelia Capitolina, the city of the family of Hadrian, right? Of Jupiter of the Capitoline. And so almost forgetting the fact that this is Jerusalem, the holy city, we normally call it Aelia Capitolina, and that's what they wrote. They talked about it as Aelia. And so this naming can sometimes be very meaningful and sometimes not be meaningful at all. But it's always important. So I guess that's a long answer. Please.
Okay, we'll take one more in person, and then I have an online question. Go ahead.
Early on that that Josephus used the name Bethsaida only once, and then he used did he use Julius many times?
Yes.
And what other pieces of information do we gather from what he said about Julius?
He uses it several times. I couldn't give you an exact number, but he uses it, let's say, 7 or 8 times in his writings. He uses Julius. He describes, there's a famous battle. There's a famous battle during the Jewish revolt. Josephus actually leads troops there and fights the mercenary army of on the plain near Bethsaida, whichever one you want to pick, that plain there. And he describes a battle that takes place. He actually falls. He's on a horse and falls off and gets injured, and they have to, his men come and get him and take him and rescue him and take him off over to Magdala. So there are, he does describe it. He knows it very personally, knows it, but he always calls it Julius. And he never, the only time he calls it Bethsaida is this one time in Antiquities, in the description of the transformation of the urbanization of it.
Which makes a lot of sense, because what Roman would have known it as Bethsaida, but it was on what must have been the Roman city list as Julius.
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember, he's probably writing these in Rome. So he's writing it for an audience that may not be familiar with the term Bethsaida. So I have a question here. It says, can you say something about the small oil lamps found in Area B? The oil lamps that were found in Area B, and that's the sort of earlier site, earlier excavation. There was actually a small area that was excavated and then closed up, are small lamps, what are called discus lamps. There are several of them that were found, which are, again, Roman period. I think more interesting, actually, are styles of lamps found there, and especially in Area C, where a couple of folks here this evening excavated. They were part of the team in Area C last summer. They found what are called the Herodian knife-paired lamps, the lamps that are distinctively Jewish and generally are identified with Jerusalem. So it seems that, that the general thought is that these are lamps of a particular style that are made in Jerusalem, but somehow find their way up to where we are. So there's a Jerusalem connection. Certainly that, as well as stone vessels, the stoneware that's found, which is distinctively, these are markers for a Jewish population, having to do with kosher laws in terms of dealing with the religious laws. These are markers of Jewish settlement. So it seems that this is a Jewish village in its earliest stage, and then it seems to be transformed. As I said, it becomes then more of an urbanized center with the elements that you would expect more to find in a Romanized city. I'll just read, try to get a question here that Steve can weigh. So I have the question, would fishing have continued to be the main industry as Bethsaida changed from village to city? You can speak to that. What about the reputation of fishing in rabbinic literature? You have...
Fishing is very important on this side of the sea. It's just major economic stuff. It is so strange watching myself behind Steve Notley, I've got to tell you. But it is
it's like Big Brother,
It's a major industrial piece of the pie, just as in the Islamic period, sugarcane became, as you saw, a major piece of the pie. Protein was hard to get in the Roman Empire, and fish and birds were a major part of it. And so, yeah. Remember, there's a reason you have to multiply fish and loaves, because people are hungry. And so the ultimate dream, right, is to have your fish and loaves multiplied. That's a great thing. It tells you how hungry they were, how difficult it was to achieve their daily bread. And here was a body of water full of food floating around. And we shouldn't forget that. Most people in Jerusalem and surroundings and the whole Roman world were pretty malnourished and died pretty young. And we always have to remember that fact.
Yeah, the northeast corner of the lake actually is, according to the people who fish it, say it's the best fishing there. You have sardines, you have other things up there in the northeast part of the lake. It's an area to this day, it's an area that's heavily fished. So that's, there's a reason that Herod Antipas, the brother of Herod Philip, establishes a presence on the lake, as well as Herod Philip. They're trying to take advantage of the industry, the fishing industry, things attached to the lake. So those would have continued even, as we move into the other centuries. Is there another, I'll get a...
Well, first I'll say what a fun, interesting night. So thank you very much. Secondly, just a little comment before the question. My family was in that area between 2008 and 11 for a while, in and out, not regularly. But I have to tell you, gentlemen, when we came by the sign that you've both referred to as Bethsaida, farther up the hill, in typical fashion, I said, this isn't right. So I'm with you. Secondly, the question is, help me out. There's a house that is called Peter's House over at Capernaum, or the site identified as Capernaum, and you've both referred to a Peter House site at this site too.
Okay. This is this one's in my area, actually. We have two different traditions in we have reference in the Gospels to Peter's mother-in-law, Peter's home being in Capernaum, and then we have the passage in John 1:44 speaking of Peter's home at Bethsaida, and you have these sort of two traditions. There is someone actually wrote in and asked about the church. You have an octagonal church, Byzantine church built at Capernaum, and seems to commemorate Peter's house. That's the tradition, at least, that we have there, that this is Peter's house. So it seems that you have two vying traditions. I mean, Steve already brought up the question of the burial site in place of Jesus's burial, his death and burial and resurrection, although he didn't mention the resurrection, but the death and burial, but at the Garden Tomb and the Holy Sepulchre. And so you have these vying traditions, and it seems that you have two different traditions up there regarding Peter's home. And both of those are witnessed to within the Gospels, but certainly pilgrims. We have pilgrims speaking quite clearly about the church at Bethsaida. So that's what But there are two different traditions there. There are both within the Gospels, and it seems that also within, as we move into Byzantine period as well. Okay. Okay. Oh, this is an interesting question. What evidence would it take for you to be 100% sure about this site?
Sign.
There's few things that, what?
A sign, one way or the other, right?
Oh, a sign.
Either a sign in the world.
You don't mean like a heavenly sign. You mean yeah.
Or you can choose which one you want, right?
Yeah,
it's a heavenly sign that has a different purpose.
I mean, to be honest, I don't want to, but I actually, the argument has been made to me, your site cannot be the site because the Israeli government has already decided that it's the other site because there's a sign there. And I don't know. I think it's a good question. At what point do we reach a tipping point of saying that it's finished? We tend to be a little bit more careful. We say that we're the leading candidate. None of us sort of speaks like, this is, it's proven 100% certain, because as Steve said, I could be dead and gone 40 years later. Someone comes along and moves it, finds another place that may be more fitting. I don't know, but I would say that in the 4 seasons that we've excavated, we've not found anything that would be contrary to it being the site of Bethsaida Julius. I can say that the other site, there's a lot missing and there are problems for me. Even before we excavated, I had problems. As I said, already in 2007, I'm publishing saying there is a problem here. It's someplace else. I don't know where it is, but it's someplace else. I can't say that where we are. Everything we find, even this uncanny, and I'm the only one that gets excited about a 40-centimeter gap. But and they're all trying to, when we're digging it and we're saying that there's 40 centimeters of a gap of silt there. And I said, exactly, that's exactly what we want, because that's what the historical sources say. And this is that type of sort of interdisciplinary approach, which is quite lovely on our site, because we'll sit and start arguing You know, the historian will belittle the archaeologist belittles the historian, but we all do it recognizing that we're bringing our perspectives in a multidisciplinary approach to this. But I would say what we're lacking is more excavation. We want to expand our excavation, to excavate more of the area. And I would say the more that we find, and there's, as I mentioned, we've already done electromagnetic imaging, and there is a lot under the ground to be excavated. And when that is excavated, it'll get to a point where they can't deny it anymore. It will not, you can't dismiss it, you can't ignore it, you can't say, oh, this is just a Roman camp, someone set up camp here and built a bath. That's the argument now, that what we have is this small little camp. Well, that's why we excavated farther out. So I think as we expand the excavation and we find more and more things that fit both a Jewish settlement, village, and the urbanization of the site that fits the historical description, I think it's a matter of time. And I would imagine that will happen fairly quickly. We hope to expand significantly next summer our efforts and to expand out and to acquire more evidence. That's really all we lack. It's just further and further evidence till it becomes so much that it's just, it can't be ignored. It has to be, you have to draw the conclusion. Otherwise it becomes special pleading regarding the other site.
Can I add something?
Sure.
It's the process that's most important. And sometimes we forget that, right? Where people made a decision, they came to a conclusion, it was an honest conclusion, and here's someone saying that their conclusion is wrong. That's humanly hard. But besides that, that's how science works. Now, when science hits heritage, right, then, well, where do I build the church? Where do I go to pray? Where do I go to think about our ancestors? Where do I go? And then that's when the question comes up. As long as this is an academic question, it's an academic question of the sort that we have on all sorts of subjects. But when we really care about it, which is what this site provokes, then it becomes, all right, so where do I go? Where am I going to go to imagine the world of Peter? And that's the question here that looms really large. And I'm so hoping that an inscription comes up in that church that answers the whole question. That would be great.
Yeah, I think if we excavate next summer, and I know Moti really wants to have the church fully excavated because it will have an inscription. And hopefully if the inscription has survived, it will identify when it was built and to what it was built to commemorate.
Right.
Before we found the mosaics, there were very serious scholars who were writing Moti privately, telling him, Notley's led you astray. There's no church there. The church that Willibald talks about, he was mistaken. It's the one in Capernaum. And so Moti and I had a conversation, and I said, look, this can't be. You, more than anybody in the world, you have the glass tessera in your hand. You know there's a church here. We just don't have it yet. And when we found the mosaics, then the line was, well, this is a different church. This is not that church. And so there's always people who are saying so we need to find the inscription to identify the church. And then what you can say is that the Christian community, at least in the Byzantine period, has a memory that is the site. That does not prove it's first century Bethsaida. That does not, because there are Byzantine sites that remember events or remember things that are not correct, not accurate. But if under those Byzantine remains, we continue to find large settlement in the Roman period, then that together, both of those things together, I think becomes evidence that's too weighty to ignore. So, any other questions? Okay. I'm done on the screen here on the.
Thank you so much. Can you join me once again in thanking Professor Notley and Professor Fine? Thank you everyone for joining us here tonight, both virtually and on site. And we welcome you to come visit Museum of the Bible during the day. We also have a program next week that's virtual, that's on the 400th anniversary of Plymouth and the Mayflower. So if you would like to join us for that, you can find more information on our website. Thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you.